Alright, in this video we are going to add some elements to our canvas here. Okay, so we have set up our canvas in the previous video here. We now want to add a few things to this. Now, the one thing I want to first start off here and show you is how we should properly be adding items to our canvas. Now, to begin this, we have to understand that elements inside of our canvas here are using this rect transform. Remember, I mentioned this little rect transform here that is part of our canvas. Anything else that I place on my canvas here should really be tapping into this rect transform as well and be positioned and be utilizing that built-in system that Unity is using here. Here's what I mean. If I take something like, let's say, an empty game object like this and say this is going to be my icon, okay, and then I give it some kind of a sprite render like this, and I provide it with a little sprite here and say, you know what, this is going to be my little icon that I want to put in the top right corner of my game. Okay, here's what happens. If I take my little icon like this and just click and drag it over my canvas so I make it a child of my canvas, you'll note that it still works properly. It still is a child of my canvas, but it is not tapping into the rect transform component here that I have. And in fact, if I try and add it here, I can, you know, and then it's like kind of all broken up. It's all kind of mishmashed all together here. It's much safer and it's a much cleaner of a process to do all of this using the menu systems that Unity has provided to us. And what I mean by that is to utilize here all of the UI options that I showed you in the first video. And so most, if not all, UI items that you're going to be having on your screen will boil down to some variation of this. You can have images, you can have toggles, you can have panels and whatnot. All of this is fair play for UI. There's very few things that I can think of that may not fit into one of these categories. And so when you are developing your UI for your game, I recommend going through this menu system because it just makes your life a lot easier. So let's do that then. Now I want to start off by adding some score text, okay? And so we have to think about where score text is going to be. I think I'm going to place it in the top left corner here. Again, if you looked at the lectures on UI, you will note that us as Western countries, many of the Western speaking world read their respective language from left to right. So most English is read from left to right. Things like French, Spanish, those are all read from left to right. Very, very popular languages. And by and large, a lot of the game development that occurs, at least here in North America, is geared towards the English audience. And so we can make a few assumptions about the person that is going to be playing like this. Now, I will mention as well that there is this idea of localization. Localization refers to taking your game and making sure that the language and the presentation of the language will adhere to the local culture. And that will include things like placing writing from right to left if you're in parts of the Middle East, for instance. And so in our case here, we're sticking with English. We're going to do this from left to right. Naturally, as an English speaker, what we tend to do whenever we are on a website, whenever we are reading something, is our eyes immediately go to the top left corner of whatever we're reading. Okay? And so that's why if you go to popular websites up here, let me see if I can open up a popular website. Let's go to Microsoft.com here. Just make sure everything is good. If we go to Microsoft.com, okay, immediately if you go to the top left corner of the page, you can see it's already presenting to you a menu system, right? It's already designed in such a way to take advantage of the fact that, oh yeah, we're going to go to the top left corner immediately. And so it shows you a bunch of options here. And what also happens here is as we see this, if we don't see anything interesting, we begin to scan down along the sides and we go to about midway to the bottom part of our screen just to find something interesting. You will note that in the bottom right corner, right down here, it's empty. There is nothing down here at all. That's again because as English speakers, we are drawn to the top left and reading from left to right. So most of the menu systems you'll see are on the left or along the top of websites. And so optimally designed websites will adhere to those designs here. In our case here, we want to make sure that our information is in the top left corner. That's going to be very easy for our players to look at. And so we're going to place it somewhere up here. All right, so a lot of talk there. Doing this is actually quite simple. What we want to do is we want to right click on our canvas here and we want to go to UI and we want to select what kind of object we want to place there. The one that I want to place is text. Okay, I want to place a very simple text here that I can somehow control in future videos. Okay, so I'm going to click text. what happens is I get this little box right in the middle here, okay? And you can barely see it, I think, here, but if I scroll right in there, you can see the word new text here, okay? So this is kind of the default little text that we have, and we have to work from. All right, let's work from here. First thing I want to do is name it. Let's name this appropriately. I'm going to call this my score text, okay? So that is now called my score text object, and I can refer to it very easily. The next thing we want to do here is we want to look at the rect transform. You can see we get a rect transform automatically because we are using the built-in menu from Unity, and it's just a lot easier to work with. Now, it is instinctual for us now to take this text object and just say, all right, we need to put it up in the top right corner, hit the W key, move it up to the top right corner here, and we're good to go. And while, yes, that will actually work, we can take a few kind of precautions or kind of few advantages. We can take advantage of a few things here that are built into Unity. Namely speaking, whenever I add an object here, okay, whenever I add an object as a child in my canvas, notice the position here. My position is at 0, 0, 0, but this position is not because I'm at the 0, 0, 0 of my game world. It's because I am in the middle of my canvas. Okay, the middle of my canvas is at 0, 0, 0, and you can see if I just highlight this, okay, you can see I have these dotted lines that show me the position of this object relative to the canvas itself. This is also showing me the width and my height of this particular text box, okay? And so if I take this and I move it up to the top left corner somewhere in that region, you can see here my position changes, okay? From, from 0, 0 to negative 3 all the way to 199. Okay, that's not a big deal, okay? But we can do a little bit better than that. The one thing we can look at here is this, okay? Now this here doesn't look like anything, but in fact it is a button that we can utilize to change some property of our UI. And I'm going to click on here and you can see we get this little window that appears. What this does is this allows us to change anchor presets, pivot points, and the actual physical position of whatever element we're working on. In this case is our text. And you can see by default when we add this item there, it is going to anchor itself to the middle of our canvas here. If I just click the top left or the top right or the bottom right or the bottom left, you can see something changes. What changes specifically is my anchor point. This is now telling me, without actually moving my text box, that I am positioned 400 to the right and negative 225 down. Okay, that's simply because my anchor point has now been placed in the top left corner. And so this is placed relative to where that anchor position actually is. And so this now means that I can take this item, move it somewhere closer here, and now I'm working with much smaller values, which is great. Okay, you want to work with smaller values because it's just easier to work with in general. Okay, and so that's a good start. We can actually start positioning this as we want to, but we can take it a step further here. By just clicking it, we'll change the anchor position. If I change the pivot point, you're going to see what happens here. Now, the instructions, unfortunately, through Unity are not very clear. What you actually have to do here is with this window open, you have to hold down the shift key here so that you change the anchor and the pivot point at the same time. So if I hold down the shift key, you can see this little blue dot now appears in all the squares here. If I click now in the top left corner, okay, a couple of things have changed. Number one, my position is no longer 440, whatever it was, it's actually 320, okay? This is because my pivot point, okay, basically my pivot point now moves to the top left corner of my text box, okay? Let me show you what I mean by this. Right now, if I just change my anchor point, notice the dotted lines here. The dotted lines go all the way to the middle of this text object. Down here, it goes all the way to the middle. Let me get rid of my thing here. You can see that the dotted line goes towards the middle. My dotted line goes towards the middle. If I change also my pivot point, then the dotted line goes to the top left corner. And this is basically saying that my position of this object is relative to that corner here. So the corner of this is 320 to the right and negative 210 down. Okay, I can do this one more where I can also set the actual physical position of this by holding down the Alt key as well. And so typically under normal development environment here, what I would be doing is I would be doing something like this. I would select my text box like this. I would click on this button. I would hold down both Shift and Alt, and I would click like this. And you can see the position of my text box now gets moved to the top left corner. Okay, this should be 0, although it's negative 0.00000 anyways. And so this is now positioned exactly in the corner of my canvas. Okay, my width and height have not changed, but now the top left corner is in the top left corner of my canvas, and the positions are 0, 0, 0. If you can minimize the amount of calculations you're doing here by having numbers like 0, 0, 0, and there's no actual change to the position, that's great. Even with that, even by positioning this in the top left corner, I still want to have a little bit of separation from the corner. Because if I peer into my game right now, you can vaguely see new text. Okay, new text is right smack dab in the corner. Typically speaking, you don't want to have it right butted up against the corner. You want to have a little bit of breathing room, okay? And so when you want to have a little bit of breathing room, this just means we're going to have to move it a little bit away and move it a little bit down. So I typically move it somewhere about 25 to negative 25 off of the edge there, okay? And so again, if we look very carefully, the 25 is from the right to the right side of the edge here, and negative 25 is down. If I peer into my game view, you can see it's a little bit offset. I have a little bit of breathing room around there. It looks a little bit nicer, okay? Now the next thing we have to do here is we have to adjust our width and height, but I typically like to adjust my width and height to be very large to begin with and then work my way back downwards. And so this width and height is actually the physical width and height of the text box itself. And so when we're working with UI, you can see here I have been using the transform tool. There's also the rotation and the scale tool, but hitting the T key gives me this rect tool, and this is where I can actually affect my width and my height just by clicking and dragging this around. Now I personally like to work in whole numbers, so I'll take something like this and I'll usually double it to something like a 320 by 60 just to give myself a little bit more room to work with. Again, I like working with whole numbers. Decimal points are not that bad, but again, if you can minimize it, I would recommend it. And now I want to actually place my score text here. Okay, so I've given myself ample room to write some text. Let's actually do that now. So I'm happy with the positioning. I'm happy with the width and height of this. So I will collapse this. My canvas renderer is not something we're going to be looking at here, but specifically we want to look at this text. Okay, this text component here. Now, first things first, there's a lot of stuff to look at here. Before we check any sort of settings here, I want to modify my color. Just because my background is dark, my text is dark, it's a little bit difficult to read. I'm going to change my color here just by clicking on the color option and selecting white. Okay, just so I can see it. We can change the color later on if you want to add some different colors to this, that's fine. But for now, I want to make sure that this is white. Okay, and so what we can do now is we can look into the different properties of our text here. And so the first little part that you see here is actual text that you can write. So I'm going to write something like score with a colon, and for testing purposes, generally what you want to do is you'll have a limit to the amount of numbers or characters that your game can show. So, you know, let's say that you can get a maximum of 999,999, okay? Typically what I would do is I would type that maximum value into my score just so I can make sure that I don't cut off any of the text here, because I am going to be changing this. I'm going to be increasing its size. If you don't understand what I mean here, if my text box was, let's say, this small, okay? Let's say it was just that small. Let's say I had a score of 9,999 and I got another extra point and all of a sudden it got to 10,000. You'll see it automatically goes down to the next line, and that doesn't look very good. And so we have to make sure that we account for the maximum size possible and that our text box is big enough to accommodate this. Here you're going to see properties for font. Now by default, Unity has one font and one font only, that is Arial. And so what I want to do is I want to show you guys how to actually get some font in your game and where to actually go to get font in your game. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to go to Google Fonts. Okay, this is one of many, many, many resources out here. If we just search up fonts on Google again, you can see here we have IG fonts. I've gone to DaFonts as well, which I thought was actually quite nice. So actually, let me try DaFonts. I've recently came across that. Let's see if we can find something here that is nice. And so here we look, and we can actually use the filtering tool here to kind of whittle down what we're looking for here. You can see some of these are themed. Okay, so some of these are not themed. So pixel bitmap, that's kind of the area I want to look into because it looks more game-like and looks more retro. You can do things like sci-fi, okay, these like Star Wars inspired things, Transformer inspired ones as well. I'm going to stick with the pixel bitmap here, okay. I do want to have a few other kind of things that we want to look here. We can have more options. We can make sure that this is public domain and 100% free. Okay, we can do that to make sure that we're not paying for anything in particular. What I generally look at is the comments. Okay, you can see here these are all 100% free. I kind of like this one here. This is nice because you can do a little bit of test here. So if you want to do, I can say here score 999999 here. It will actually show me what the score would look like if it was properly in place here. Okay, so it gives you a little preview of the window. I think that looks pretty good. And so what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to click download. And this is going to download to my computer. Okay, it's just off screen here. Let me very quickly grab this. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into my folder. Sorry, let me bring this over to you guys here. I'm going to go into my assets folder here, and just to keep things nice and organized, I'll create a new folder here called fonts, and I'll paste this VCROSD_mono font in there. Okay, I'll just close. Again, this is inside of my assets folder in my project. You can't see it here in Unity. Now, when you do place something like a font in Unity like this, let's just have a look here to make sure it is set up. It is right there, right there. The second you add this in here, Unity automatically detects that you have this Unity set up. Now, the font itself, you do have import settings for the fonts. You can change things like font size if you want, or render mode if you want something to be defaulted to the operating system, or hinted rasterization, the type of character that you want to use, Unicode, ASCII characters as well. There's a lot of options that you have here. Generally, I dig into the options if it is not behaving in the way I want. And so what I'm going to do here, because this is part of my project, I'm just going to click on my score text here. And now if I go and select my font and click on the button to the right side, you'll see it actually finds that font appears in my project. And I'll just double click on it, and you can see it has now applied that font directly to my game. Now, one reminder here, based from the lectures that you guys have seen, in your games, it's generally advised that you select one font and one font only, and use that throughout your game. And make sure that the font you do select is reflective of the type of game that you're making. So my game is kind of like a retro side-scrolling space shooter, so I picked a retro kind of font there. It's kind of an 8-bit looking font. If you're making a Western, if you're making a tank game, you may want to look at different kinds of font that will match that aesthetic. Okay, and so that is how you would select a different font there. Next little option here is font style. So if I want bold and italic, I can have bold and italic. I usually stick to normal. Some of these kind of 8-bit style fonts, when you add bold to them, they become a little bit blurry and harder to read. You can see they become blurry around the edges, and I'm not a fan of that. And so I generally stick with this. You can see there is a little sense of blurriness. Okay, this is something we can look into very shortly here. But in general, what I like to do is I like to just increase my font size till we get to a point that I'm happy with. What I also like to do is, if I don't have a 2-monitor setup, I like to split my screen like this and have a general idea of how big this score is going to look in my game view. So you can see this is actually quite large. And so what I like to do is let's shrink this down to maybe about, let's say about 22. Okay, we'll keep it at about 22 here. And we could actually reposition this a little bit closer to the corner. Let's say if I change this to a 15 and a -15. Still a little bit to the corner. It is out of the way. You don't really want it part of the middle, but you want it big enough so that you can read it. Okay? And so my game is now going to have a score that looks like this. I still think that might be a tad bit too large. Perhaps I'll shrink it down to about an 18. Okay, that might be a little bit nicer right there. Again, personal preference. By no means do you have to follow exactly with the values I have here. If you want it to be bigger or smaller or in a different position, go ahead and try it. Okay? A couple other things that we have here, line spacing. This is going to try and force everything to be on exactly one line. Rich text is set up by default, so we can use things like emoticons and colors if we need to as well. You can turn that off if you need performance boosts. Next little thing here is alignment. And so if I'm back in my scene view, I can align this towards the middle of my text box. I can align it towards the center of my text box, middle, and middle. Generally, I like to do it in the center here, but in this case, I will place it in the far left. And then what I'll do is I will change the height of this to match the contours of my text. So I reduce my height down to 30. It is back down right to there. Okay. Going down here, we can align based on geometry. This is going to align based on the geometry of the rectangle itself. That requires a few extra calculations. We're not going to worry about that. Our horizontal overflow basically means exactly what I demonstrated earlier, which is if I go past the edge of this, then I will simply wrap down towards the bottom here. So I'll wrap down towards the bottom. Likewise for our vertical, you can see if this goes beyond my characters here. So if I keep typing out more characters, you can see it truncates it, and truncates it simply means that it removes that item there. So if I change this to overflow, then what we'll get here is my text overflowing. Okay, let me expand this out a little bit. Expand this out a little bit. Oops, here. And if we change these guys to overflow, then what we're going to see here is something that looks more like this. Okay, it's going to overflow off of the side of the text box rather than it being controlled. But again, as developers, we should be in 100% control here. Best fit works when you have a width and a height like this. What this will try and do is it will try and expand the size of your text to fit inside of the box as best as possible. So that is what this best fit does. If you read the technical documentation of this, Unity themselves suggest to avoid using this if you can, because it can be quite detrimental to performance. So it's usually wise to keep it off. Again, let me just keep this to our normal 360 by 30, I believe it was here. I will shrink down this width actually. I'll shrink it down to about 160. Okay, I'm happy with that. If there's a little bit of an edge here, it's not a big deal. Scrolling down here, obviously I mentioned already color. Color is a very, very important thing to look at here, and this is actually what I find to be one of the downfalls of most games and most student projects, not only in game development, but when you're making websites itself. Students will do things like, hey, I like blue, and I'm going to pick a blue text, and all of a sudden you have blue text on blue background. Or you will do the opposite, where you'll take something that is very, very stark right in your face like a red, like this, and all of a sudden you have this very, very intense red on a very kind of dark background. And this sort of red text on dark backgrounds, especially on electronic devices, can be unappealing to many. And so you generally want to stick with softer colors, okay, colors that are easier to look at. If you're always in doubt, white is fine, especially on a dark background like this. If this background was not white, not dark, instead it was just white. So let's say that it was something like this. Oops, let's see if I can get this. Okay, no. I guess I can't find that one particular UI there. Okay, that's not a problem. Let's go back. If this was on a lighter thing, you would want to suggest something darker. If you're interested in selecting particular colors and understanding what kind of color scheme you can use here, there are a lot of tools that exist for generating color palettes. So color palette, let's say generator. Okay, there are a lot of websites out here that allow you to generate color palettes very, very easily. And so what I would do here is I would play with some of these tools. You can see here, you can generate new color palettes that are complementary to each other. This goes into color theory, which we do not talk about in this class. There's a whole whack of things that you can do based on color theory. But using things like color palettes is very, very useful. So if I was making a game using this and I knew for sure that this was going to be my background, I would feed in the various colors to this and I would look for complementary colors for that background. Okay. But white for now is going to be fine. You can add material, so things like textures to this. There is the option raycast, but we're not going to talk about raycasting. Raycasting is something a little bit too advanced for this. Okay. So I went into a lot of detail for just one little piece of text here. Ideally, this could be hashed out in about a minute or two once you are familiar and comfortable with all this, but it's good to understand what all of these different values are. So this was our score text. In the next video, I'm going to do both the game over text and the restart text as well. So I'll see you in that video. Goodbye.